I kept rehearsing the sentence in my head the way a man worries a loose tooth with his tongue, testing it, hiding it, returning to it until it hurt. It wasn't bravery that stopped me. It wasn't loyalty either. It was that thin, practical fear that lives behind the ribs and never makes a sound, the kind that doesn't announce itself as cowardice. It calls itself caution. It calls itself timing. It calls itself not making trouble. It whispers that the world is already heavy enough without my words added to it. I remember the taste of metal in the air, though I couldn't have told you where it came from. The smell of damp wool and old smoke. The way boots sounded different when men were tense. Harder, quicker, as if the floor had turned to ice and everyone was trying not to slip. No one said it out loud, but we all felt the same tightening, the same small listening in the body. Like waiting for a door to open that you pray stays shut. There are moments when you can see a mistake forming the way you can see a storm climbing up the horizon. Not the storm itself, just the shift, the hush, the sudden attention to little things. A hand lingering on a strap, eyes not meeting, a laugh that dies too soon. It's not knowledge, it's recognition. It's the mind grabbing the edge of something before it falls. I had that recognition. It came like a cold coin pressed against the spine. I tried to talk myself out of it at first. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd misunderstood. It's easy to doubt yourself in places where certainty belongs only to the loud. In places where questions are treated like stains, and a man learns to keep his thoughts folded up small so they don't show through his face. I watched mouths move around me. Watched hands gesture, watched heads nod with the kind of agreement that is less belief than survival. And in my own head, the sentence kept pacing like an animal behind a fence. Say it now. Not yet. Say it before it's too late. Don't be the one who slows everything down. I could already feel what would happen if I spoke. Not the grand punishment people imagine, but the smaller violence, the stare that turns you into a problem. The silence that follows your words, heavy and offended. The way your name would become a shorthand for inconvenience. The way even the ones who secretly agreed with you would avoid standing too close, as if doubt were contagious. Fear is clever. It doesn't need to threaten you with death. It threatens you with being seen. I told myself there would be another chance. A better moment. A private word. A quiet correction slipped in where it wouldn't bruise anyone's pride. I told myself I needed proof, something solid enough to justify the disruption my warning would cause, as if disaster waits patiently for paperwork. There was also the deeper, uglier thought. What if I was wrong? What if my sentence, so heavy in my mouth, was only a shadow, and I made it real by speaking it? What if I forced everyone to look at something that wasn't there, and in doing so I became the source of fear instead of its witness? I held the sentence back and felt it swell, pressing against my throat. Outside my mind, everything continued with the steady rhythm of decisions being made by people who didn't have to live inside my hesitation. The world had its own momentum. It moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to the small panic of one quiet man trying to decide whether words could change anything. I remember a brief pause, so brief no one else would have called it a pause. A breath held a fraction too long. A glance that slid past me without landing. In that sliver of time, I could have stepped out of myself. I could have let the sentence go. Instead, I swallowed it. And in the act of swallowing, I understood something that would follow me like a second shadow. The decision had already been made, not by anyone above me, but by the fear that kept everyone quiet, starting with me. By the time the days began to blur together, I could tell what kind of place we were in without needing it explained to me. It was the kind of place where sound traveled farther than it should, where a man learned to keep his voice level and his face empty. Even laughter had to be earned, and when it came thin and careful, like a match struck in wind. There were rules written down somewhere, but the real ones lived in posture and routine, in the way men stood when someone senior entered a room, in the way conversations bent around certain names, in the way a question could be asked like an accusation, and an answer could be given like a confession. The hierarchy wasn't a ladder so much as a ceiling. You felt it above you even when you couldn't see it. We lived close enough to know each other's habits without ever knowing what mattered to anyone. The small intimacies of shared hardship were allowed. The larger ones were not. You could borrow a cigarette. You could trade a button. You could offer a brief nod that meant, "I see you." But you didn't offer opinions unless you were asked for them. And even then, you offered them in the shape the room could tolerate. The room mattered. The room always mattered. Some rooms were plain, wood, canvas, a table scarred by knives and cups, a few lamps that turned every face into a half-lit mask. Others were cleaner, tighter, arranged in such a way that you could feel the importance of the people inside before you heard a word. In those rooms, papers lay flat, and maps stayed folded until the right hands opened them. Chairs weren't just chairs. They were permissions. I learned early to pay attention to small signals. A pause before someone spoke. A hand resting on a belt, not for comfort but for authority. The angle of a chin. The way eyes moved over a man when he entered, measuring, naming, sorting. It was a system that ran on instinct as much as procedure, and it rewarded those who understood its language without needing it translated. I wasn't anyone important. That wasn't modesty. It was simply true. I did work that kept me close enough to hear things without being invited to shape them, close enough to carry messages, to stand by while decisions were discussed, to see faces tighten when a question was raised and relax when it was crushed under certainty. There was a kind of safety in being small. Small men are useful. They are present and invisible at once. They become part of the background, a shadow that moves where it's told. But the safety came with a price. You were expected to absorb what you witnessed and let it pass through you without leaving a mark. It didn't matter that we were all trapped in the same machine. The machine needed structure to run. It needed men who could give orders without hearing themselves doubt, and men who could follow without asking what the order might cost. It needed faces that looked calm, even when they weren't. It needed silence as a kind of fuel. Sometimes, in the hours between tasks when the air went still and the noise of work faded, you could feel the unspoken weight hanging over us like damp cloth. It was never discussed directly. That would have given it shape, and shape could be challenged. Instead, it was hinted at with clipped jokes and half-sentences. A man would start to say something and stop. Another would answer with a look that said, "Not here, not like that." There were consequences for speaking in the wrong way at the wrong time. Not always the dramatic kind. Usually not. The system didn't need to punish loudly. Loud punishment drew attention. It preferred smaller corrections, a reassignment, a sudden coldness where there had been friendliness. Your name said with a certain tone. A note made in a book you never saw. And worse than that was the social consequence. The quiet exile. Men are herd animals in places like that. Isolation can kill you faster than bullets. A man who became unreliable, who became difficult, found himself alone in a crowd. It was a slow hunger. So we learned. We learned to speak through filters, to ask questions that sounded like requests for clarity, not doubt, to offer concerns as logistics, not morality, to keep anything that resembled a warning buried under neutral words and a steady voice. Even then, you could feel the risk in the air, like static before a storm. Above us, there were men who carried themselves as if certainty were a uniform. They moved with the confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed. They were not monsters. That would have been too simple. They ate, they smoked, they joked, they wrote letters. They could be kind in small ways. But they lived in a world where hesitation was an infection, and conscience was something you kept private if you wanted to keep your place. The ones closest to them, the men who served as echoes, as buffers, as loyal instruments, were often worse. Not because they believed more, but because they needed to prove they belonged. They policed tone. They watched faces. They corrected anyone who looked uncertain. They made sure the air stayed clean of doubt. And then there were the rest of us, the ones who watched. I began to notice how fear worked its way into routine, how it taught men to anticipate disapproval before it arrived, how it made them rehearse obedience even when no one was watching. A man would stand straighter, not because he respected someone, but because he feared being noticed for standing wrong. A man would nod before he understood, because understanding could come later, and nodding was required now. There were phrases that floated around. repeated until they became truth through repetition. Words about duty, about discipline, about doing what needed to be done. They were spoken with a tired sort of reverence, as if saying them could keep the world from falling apart. And maybe, for some, it did. Maybe those phrases were the only scaffolding they had left. I told myself I was like everyone else, that whatever unease I carried was just the normal burden of being surrounded by pressure and exhaustion, that the sentence in my throat from earlier, the one I had swallowed, was not a sign of something real, only a symptom of stress. But certain things stayed with me. The way information flowed, for one. It didn't move evenly. It moved downward as command and upward as report, but never sideways as honest conversation. You could feel where the gaps were, where pieces were missing, where men filled empty spaces with assumptions because asking for more made you look weak, and you could feel the danger of knowing too much while having no authority to use it. Sometimes I would be in the wrong place at the right time, standing near a doorway, waiting for a hand signal, carrying something that gave me an excuse to be present. I would hear a few lines that weren't meant for me, not secrets exactly, just fragments. A reference to a plan, a concern brushed away, a warning said as a joke, a name spoken with irritation, a phrase that landed in the gut before the mind could explain why. I never looked like I was listening. That was another rule. You learned to keep your eyes unfocused, your expression mild. You learned how to be a piece of furniture. I watched, and I learned. And the more I learned, the more I understood why no one spoke plainly. It wasn't only fear of punishment. It was fear of disturbing the illusion that things were under control. Control was the religion. The whole structure depended on the belief that the people above knew what they were doing. If that belief cracked, everything cracked with it. So doubts were treated like betrayal, even when they were practical, even when they were correct, especially when they were correct. Because a correct doubt was not just a complaint, it was a threat to the architecture of obedience. I saw men swallow their words in real time. I saw it in their throats, in the quick blink, in the small shift of weight as they decided not to take a step forward. I saw men make peace with decisions they didn't understand by repeating the same comforting lie. Someone must have thought of that. Someone must know something I don't. And the most dangerous lie of all was the one we told ourselves quietly, over and over. If it were truly wrong, someone would say something. Days passed in this way. Routine layered over tension, order layered over doubt. The machinery ran. The hierarchy held. Silence did its work. And somewhere inside that silence, the sentence I had swallowed began to change. It stopped feeling like a thought and started feeling like a responsibility, a thing that belonged to me whether I wanted it or not. But in that world, responsibility without authority was just another kind of trap. And I could feel the trap tightening, not because anyone had closed it yet, but because I had already accepted, without admitting it, that when the moment came, I would probably stay quiet again. The longer I carried it, the heavier it became. Not the fear itself, but the effort of containing it. Fear, at least, has direction. It points you away from danger. What I carried pointed inward. It folded back on itself, day after day, until every quiet moment felt crowded. I began to measure time differently, not by hours or tasks, but by how long I could go without returning to the same thought. Sometimes I would manage a few minutes, sometimes only seconds. The sentence I had swallowed no longer stayed whole. It broke into fragments, sharp and insistent, resurfacing at the worst moments. While I worked, while I stood waiting, while I lay awake listening to other men breathe, I argued with myself in a language no one else could hear. You don't know enough. You know enough to be afraid. Fear isn't proof. Neither is silence. I would picture myself speaking and feel my body react as if it were already happening. My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. My shoulders pulled in, defensive, as though words could draw fire. The imagination didn't need to stretch far. I had seen what happened to men who disrupted the flow. Not ruined, just diminished. Their presence thinned. Their opinions stopped being invited. They became cautionary shapes at the edge of the room. I told myself I wasn't afraid of consequences. That wasn't entirely true. I was afraid of the wrong ones, afraid of consequences that arrived quietly and stayed, afraid of being marked. In places like that, being marked was worse than being punished. Punishment ended. A mark followed you. It altered how people spoke to you, how they waited for you to finish before continuing without you. It changed the way authority glanced at you. Long enough to remember, short enough to deny it. I imagined the sentence leaving my mouth and watched the room react. The faces stiffening. The small frown that would pass between two men who didn't need to speak to each other to agree that I had overstepped. The way the air itself would seem to harden, as if I had introduced something impure. What if they asked me to explain? What if they didn't? The second frightened me more. Because if no one challenged my words, if they simply absorbed them and moved on, that would mean my warning had been heard and dismissed. And dismissal carried its own kind of guilt. It meant I would know with clarity that I had been correct enough to be acknowledged and powerless enough to be ignored. There were moments when the pressure became unbearable. Small, ordinary moments. A pause before a decision was confirmed. A glance exchanged between men who thought they were aligned. A detail mentioned too casually. Each time my body leaned forward before my mind gave permission. Each time I stopped myself at the last instant. I became an expert at rationalization. This isn't the right setting. Someone else will say it better. They already know. It's not your place. Place. That word did a lot of work. It built walls inside the mind. It reminded you that the world was arranged intentionally, that lines existed for a reason. To cross them was not only dangerous, it was improper. And impropriety in that environment was a sin greater than error. Sometimes I wondered if the others felt it too, if the men around me carried their own swallowed sentences. There were signs, if you looked carefully, a hesitation that lingered too long, a jaw set tighter than necessary, a hand that started to rise and then fell back to the table. We never spoke about it. Acknowledging shared doubt would have required trust, and trust itself was rationed. I tried to imagine what courage would look like in that place. It wasn't the kind shown in stories. There were no speeches waiting to be made, no dramatic refusals. Courage, if it existed at all, would have been a single interruption, a measured tone, a careful phrase introduced at the wrong moment. And I wondered whether courage, stripped of all romance, was simply a willingness to accept becoming alone. That thought stayed with me. I watched men who seemed immune to doubt, or perhaps better trained at hiding it. They spoke with assurance, corrected others without hesitation, dismissed concerns with a wave of the hand. I told myself they must see what I saw and judge it insignificant, or they must possess information I lacked, or they must trust the structure more than their own instincts. Trust was another word that did a lot of work. Trust in process. Trust in experience. Trust that someone, somewhere, had already accounted for the unease curling in my stomach. Trust allowed men to sleep. It allowed them to move forward without looking too closely at the ground beneath their feet. I wanted that trust. I envied it. I tried to borrow it. When that failed, I tried to dull the feeling. I focused on tasks, on repetition, on the comfort of routine. I counted steps. I memorized schedules. I paid attention to surfaces, textures, sounds, anything that anchored me to the present, and away from the future my mind insisted on sketching. But the future crept in anyway. It arrived in flashes. A consequence imagined, then dismissed. A chain of events glimpsed and immediately pushed aside. I told myself I was being dramatic. That war had a way of amplifying ordinary risks into imagined catastrophes. That fear made prophets out of fools. And yet, the images came uninvited. Not graphic, not specific, just impressions. Absence. Silence where there should have been noise. Spaces where men should have stood. Each time I shook my head slightly, as if I could dislodge the thought, as if my body were a container that could be emptied by force. There was also pride, though I was reluctant to name it. The quiet pride of being trusted to stay in my lane, of not causing friction, of being reliable. That pride whispered that speaking up would be a kind of vanity, a desire to matter beyond my station. Who are you to interrupt? Who are you to think you see what others don't? That voice sounded reasonable. It wore the mask of humility. It reminded me that restraint was a virtue, that discipline meant knowing when to remain silent. It framed obedience not as submission, but as professionalism. I clung to that framing. When exhaustion set in, when the days pressed too closely together, the internal arguments lost their sharp edges and became a dull ache. The sentence in my throat no longer demanded release. It simply waited, patient, certain. I would catch myself imagining what I would say if asked directly, not volunteering but responding. That felt safer, reactive instead of proactive, as if morality worked on invitation. But no one asked. They rarely do. The system wasn't built to solicit doubt. It was built to move forward. Questions slowed things down. Hesitation created vulnerability, and vulnerability in wartime was treated as a flaw. So I stayed where I was, present, observant, silent, and slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted inside me. The tension didn't lessen, but it changed shape. It became familiar, livable, like a weight you forget you're carrying until you try to set it down. I stopped asking myself whether I should speak and started asking when it would be too late. That was a different kind of question, a quieter one. It didn't demand action. It only demanded patience. There is a particular danger in patience. It convinces you that waiting is a neutral act. Each day I waited. The silence thickened. It filled the spaces where words might have gone. It settled into me, shaping my posture, my breath, my sense of self. I began to understand that silence was not the absence of choice. It was a choice repeated, over and over, until it no longer felt like one. And still I had not yet decided. Not openly, not in words. But the longer I held my tongue, the more my body seemed to understand something my mind refused to admit. That when the moment came, when the air tightened and the decision hovered, waiting to be confirmed, I would feel the familiar weight press down, and I would likely do what I had already practiced doing so well. I would stay quiet, and the fear that kept me there would not need to speak at all. The moment didn't announce itself. It never does. There was no sharp turn, no sudden stillness that demanded attention. It arrived disguised as routine, folded neatly into the familiar rhythm of words being exchanged and acknowledged. We were gathered close enough to share the same air. I remember noticing how shallow my breathing had become, how each inhale felt like an interruption. The room was fuller than usual, not crowded, but dense. Sound didn't echo there. It settled. Every word seemed to land and stay where it fell. A sequence of statements moved around the space, calm and assured. Not rushed, not aggressive, just steady. The kind of tone that suggests the matter has already been resolved, even as it is being discussed. I stood where I always stood, just inside the edge of relevance, close enough to hear, far enough not to be expected to contribute. As the conversation unfolded, the familiar tightening began. It started low, in the stomach, then climbed. I recognized it immediately. This was the convergence I had been sensing. The abstract unease was finding its shape. Someone spoke a detail that didn't belong. It passed quickly, almost unnoticed, like a wrong note played softly in a loud room. But I heard it. My body reacted before my mind did. A slight lift of the head, a shift of weight forward. The sentence I had swallowed for days pressed hard against my throat. This was it. Not dramatic, not urgent in appearance, just the quiet hinge on which things turn. The room continued to function. Papers were adjusted. A chair scraped lightly against the floor. Someone cleared their throat. The decision was being assembled piece by piece, each part fitting too smoothly into the next. There was no space built into it for doubt. I felt heat rise into my face, then drain away, leaving a cold clarity behind. I knew exactly what I would say if I spoke. Not an accusation, not a challenge, just a correction, a small one. The kind that could still alter direction without calling attention to itself. It would have taken less than a minute. I imagined the sound of my own voice entering the room and felt a surge of vertigo, as if I were leaning out over a drop. I imagined the heads turning, not sharply but slowly. The brief pause while people recalibrated, deciding what my words meant for them. In that pause, everything would be decided. The fear did not rush me. It didn't panic. It settled its weight carefully, like a hand placed on the back of my neck. It reminded me of every time restraint had been rewarded, every time silence had kept me safe, every time speaking had been unnecessary because the machine had continued to run without my interference. I became acutely aware of my body, the stiffness in my jaw, the way my tongue pressed flat against the roof of my mouth, holding the sentence in place. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Instead, they felt locked, as if they belonged to someone else. The discussion moved closer to conclusion. Words like acceptable and sufficient were used. No one raised their voice. No one expressed doubt. The absence of conflict gave the decision a false solidity, like a bridge that looks sound until weight is put on it. I told myself I was waiting for the right opening, a natural break, a direct question, something that would justify my interruption. But the truth was simpler and harder to face. I was waiting for someone else to go first. No one did. The final confirmation came almost casually. A nod, a brief acknowledgement. The decision, now complete, shifted from possibility into fact. I felt it happen the way you feel a door close behind you. Softly, without resistance, but with finality. In that instant, the sentence inside me changed. It was no longer a warning. It was a record. I could still speak. Technically. Nothing physically stopped me. The room did not forbid it. No one looked at me in warning. But something else had taken hold. The sense that speaking now would no longer prevent anything. It would only expose me. I felt a strange relief as that realization settled. Not comfort, relief from tension. The sharp edge of decision dulled into a heavy resignation. My shoulders dropped a fraction. My breathing deepened involuntarily. Silence had won not because it was forced, but because it was easier to carry than the consequences of breaking it. The meeting ended the way these things always ended, with movement, with chairs pushed back, with men turning toward their next tasks as if nothing irreversible had occurred. The room emptied, the air lightened. I remained where I was for a moment longer than necessary, aware of the quiet inside me where the sentence had finally gone still. I did not say a word, and in not saying it, I crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because anyone marked it, but because I felt, with unmistakable clarity, that silence was no longer something I was enduring. It was something I had chosen. The first signs came softly, almost politely, as if the world were testing whether it truly had permission to proceed. A delay here, a silence where there should have been a response. Small irregularities that could be explained away if one wanted to explain them away. Everyone did. I watched men adjust to the changes without acknowledging them. They recalibrated routines, filled gaps with assumptions, moved forward because forward was the only direction the structure allowed. When something didn't arrive on time, it was noted without concern. When a report sounded thinner than usual, it was accepted. When a name stopped being mentioned, it was quietly replaced by another. The machine absorbed the first shock without complaint. I felt it differently. Each small deviation landed in me like a confirmation quietly stamped and filed. I didn't need evidence. I recognized the shape of what was happening because I had seen it forming long before it moved. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from surprise, but from recognition. It doesn't spike. It spreads. It settles into the body and rearranges your sense of time. Past, present, and future collapse into a single continuous pressure. I began to notice absences more than presences. Empty spaces where men should have been standing. Equipment left untouched longer than expected. Conversations that ended too quickly when certain topics drifted too close to what was no longer being said. No one announced anything. There were no speeches, no explanations offered to those who didn't require them. Information traveled downward in fragments, stripped of context, softened by euphemism. Loss was described as delay, failure as complication, consequence as circumstance. I learned to listen to what wasn't included. At night, when the noise finally receded, my thoughts had room to move. They returned to the moment I had stayed silent and replayed it with brutal precision, not changing it, not rewriting it, just observing it again and again as if repetition might dull its edges. Instead, it sharpened them. Every confirmation that arrived, quiet, indirect, undeniable, tightened something in my chest. I began to understand that fear had not protected me from responsibility. It had only delayed my awareness of it. Men spoke around the consequences, not about them. They discussed adjustments, replacements, next steps. The language was efficient, professional, emotionally neutral. It allowed the work to continue without interruption. I participated when required. I answered when addressed. My voice sounded normal to my own ears, which felt like a betrayal. I had expected it to crack, to reveal me. It didn't. Silence, once chosen, had a way of training the body to cooperate. There were moments when someone would pause mid-sentence, as if sensing the outline of something unspoken. Their eyes would flick briefly across the room, searching, not for answers, but for confirmation that no one intended to ask the wrong question. When they found it, they continued. I wondered if anyone else was counting the same details I was, if anyone else was mapping the same quiet pattern of loss. We never compared notes. To do so would have required admitting that we had noticed. And noticing, in that environment, was already dangerous. The weight of it followed me everywhere. Not dramatically. It didn't press me to my knees. It sat just behind every action, every word, every pause. I felt it when I reached for objects, when I stood still, when I lay awake staring at nothing. I began to envy ignorance. Not stupidity, but genuine not knowing. The kind that allows a man to accept explanations at face value and move on. Knowledge without authority had become a burden I couldn't set down. There were moments, brief, irrational, when I caught myself wishing the outcome had been different, not because I doubted my fear, but because a wrong fear would have absolved me. If nothing had happened, my silence could have been reframed as wisdom, restraint, professionalism. But the world did not offer that mercy. The consequences unfolded without spectacle. They did not arrive all at once. They accumulated. Each new piece settled neatly beside the last, forming a structure that mirrored the one I had sensed in advance. I watched men adapt to the new reality with grim efficiency. They learned where not to look, which names not to say, which details to skip. Survival demanded it. And through it all, no one ever turned to me and said, "You should have spoken." That absence was its own indictment, because it meant my silence fit perfectly into the system. It required no explanation. It caused no disruption. It allowed everything to proceed exactly as it had been designed to. I understood then that guilt does not always announce itself with shame. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. I had not caused what happened. That truth mattered less than I had once believed. What mattered was that I had recognized the danger and chosen comfort over disturbance. The cost of that choice was not paid all at once. It was paid slowly, in the erosion of certainty, in the knowledge that when the moment demanded interruption, I had preserved order instead. And order, I was learning, had a price it never paid itself. By the time the full shape of the aftermath was visible, there was nothing left to say. Words would have arrived too late, stripped of purpose, reduced to confession without consequence. So I carried the realization quietly, the way everyone else carried what they could not afford to acknowledge. And in that quiet, I understood something with unsettling precision. The fear that had kept me silent had not ended when the decision was made. It had simply found something new to guard. Time did not soften it. That was the first thing I learned. Distance did nothing. New routines, new places, different faces. None of it reduced the weight. It only changed the way it pressed. The memory stayed precise. Not dramatic, not exaggerated. It did not blur at the edges the way other memories do. It remained intact, preserved by repetition. I could return to that room instantly, feel the same air in my lungs, the same stillness in my body. I remembered exactly where I stood, exactly how my hands felt at my sides, exactly how easy it would have been to open my mouth. What changed was not the memory itself, but my relationship to it. At first, I tried to keep it contained. I treated it like something fragile that would shatter if examined too closely. I avoided thinking about alternatives, avoided questions that began with if. I told myself that dwelling served no purpose, That reflection without action was indulgence. That reasoning worked for a while. But memory does not need permission to surface. It waits. It chooses its own moments. A sound in a quiet room. A phrase spoken with certainty. A pause that lingers half a second too long. Any of it could bring the moment back intact, uninvited, complete. I would feel it then. The same tightening, the same internal pressure, but without the possibility of release. There was no sentence left to speak, only the knowledge that one had once existed, and that I had kept it to myself. I began to understand that guilt does not behave the way people imagine. It does not always accuse. It does not always demand penance. Often, it simply observes. It sits beside you, calm and attentive, and waits for you to notice that it will not be leaving. I never told anyone what I had almost said, not because I was ordered not to, and not because I feared punishment anymore. That fear had changed shape. It had become something quieter and more absolute. To speak of it now would be to admit that the silence had been a decision, not an accident, not confusion, a decision made with full awareness of its weight. There were times I tried to recast it in my own mind, to frame it as inevitability, to tell myself that my words would not have altered the course already set in motion, that the structure was too rigid, the momentum too strong. Sometimes I almost believed that, but the memory never agreed with me. It preserved too much detail, the openness of the moment, the fragility of the decision before it hardened into fact. The way the room had been balanced on a narrow edge, waiting for either reinforcement or interruption. What haunted me was not certainty that I could have changed everything. It was certainty that I could have changed something. That possibility lingered like an unanswered question that no longer required an answer to remain unbearable. As years passed, the external world moved on, as it always does. Events were absorbed into larger narratives, simplified, abstracted, reduced to dates and outcomes. The human texture thinned until it could be handled without discomfort. My memory resisted that process. It did not flatten. It did not generalize. It remained personal, intimate, exact, a private archive of hesitation. I noticed changes in myself that I could not easily explain, a reluctance to speak, even when speech was invited, a carefulness that bordered on withdrawal. I found myself weighing words not for accuracy, but for risk, not for truth, but for consequence. Silence had trained me. There were moments when I watched others speak up, about smaller things, safer things, and felt a strange mix of admiration and distance. Their courage, if that is what it was, felt inaccessible to me. Not because I lacked the capacity, but because I had learned deeply what it meant to choose otherwise. I understood then that silence is not passive. It shapes you. It leaves a residue. It becomes a habit, and habits become identity. I carried the memory into ordinary life, where no one knew what it referred to. That anonymity did not lighten it. If anything, it made it heavier. The absence of witnesses meant there was no external version to counter my own. No one to say, "You did what you could." No one to say anything at all. So the story remained unfinished, looping endlessly back to the same suspended moment. Sometimes, late at night, I would replay the scene not to imagine myself speaking, but simply to observe myself not speaking. To watch the precise instant where hesitation overcame responsibility. To notice how calm it looked from the outside. How reasonable. How unremarkable. That was perhaps the hardest part. Nothing about the moment marked it as decisive. No signal announced that a line was being crossed. No sensation warned me that this silence would follow me longer than any sound ever could. It felt like nothing, and that nothing became permanent. I no longer ask myself whether I was right to stay silent. That question assumes a balance that no longer exists. Right and wrong dissolved long ago, replaced by something heavier and less articulate. What remains is awareness. The awareness that fear does not always shout. Sometimes it speaks softly, in the language of professionalism and restraint. Sometimes it disguises itself as patience. Sometimes it offers you safety in exchange for something you do not yet realize you will never get back. I did not lose sleep over the consequences alone. I lost it over the realization that when the moment required disruption, I had chosen alignment instead. Alignment with order. Alignment with silence. Alignment with the comfort of not being the one who made things harder. No one ever accused me. No one ever needed to. The fear that kept everyone quiet did not end when the danger passed. It persisted, refined, internalized. It no longer needed the environment that created it. It had learned how to survive on memory alone. And now, when I think back to that moment, the room, the air, the sentence waiting at the back of my throat, I understand something I did not understand then. Silence does not fade. It stays exactly where you leave it, waiting. And long after the world has moved on, long after explanations have replaced experience, long after consequences have been absorbed into history, it remains, unchanged, intact, asking nothing, teaching nothing, forgiving nothing, just present, just permanent.